This truly sensational case took place in West Germany. Marianne Bachmeier was born on June 3, 1950, in a small town named Zarsterd in the state of Lower Saxony in West Germany. Marianne's parents moved there immediately after the end of World War II due to persecution by her father, a former SS officer and a member of the National Socialist Party of Germany. Marianne grew up in a conservative, religiously influenced family. It is said that she did not have a happy childhood because of this. Her father was overbearing, abusive, and also a heavy drinker. He spent more time in a bar near the house than with his family. Marianne's mother also showed no emotions or empathy for her daughter. They had little contact and spent little time together. She didn't seem to care at all what her daughter was doing. The father's alcoholism gradually made him more aggressive toward the family, so the mother decided to divorce her husband. One could not say that Marianne was sad about this. On the contrary, she thought she could finally be free and happy. However, her mother soon remarried another man who turned out to be just as abusive as her biological father. Because of this, she often clashed with her stepfather and called him a dictator. Unfortunately, the young girl's mother did not take her side, but always supported her husband and threw her out of the house in one of these conflict situations. On the street, Marianne was repeatedly abused by various men. As a result of one such incident, she became pregnant. In 1966, at the age of 16, she gave birth to her first child. Due to the lack of a normal home and a steady income, Bachmeier was forced to give her firstborn child up for adoption and became pregnant again 2 years later by her then-boyfriend. Despite the unhealthy relationship with the man, Marianne insisted on keeping the fetus. Shortly after the child was born, she was again abused by a stranger. This unpleasant experience triggered a series of psychological issues for the girl. Additionally, her boyfriend decided to leave her, leaving her alone with the child without being able to support herself. Therefore, she had to place the child in foster care again. After some time, Marianne dropped out of school entirely and looked for a job to finally support herself. Around the same time, she met a man named Christian Berthold, the manager of the bar where she started working. Shortly after meeting him, they began dating, and a few months later, the girl became pregnant with her third child. This time, she was prepared to take care of raising it, as she had a steady income. However, Christian did not agree with Marianne's decision, and eventually, the young couple ended their relationship. Notably, the separation from the child's father did not affect her decision to give birth to the child. On November 14, 1972, the girl gave birth to her third child, a girl named Anna. Marianne's mother demanded that she give up this child just like the other two, but she was not willing to do so. Moreover, she could not bear the guilt of giving up a third child, so Marianne decided to be a good mother. Among other things, she underwent surgery that completely destroyed any chance of conceiving again. As she later admitted, this was quite normal at the time. Since then, the girl and her little daughter have lived in Lübeck. Despite the various difficulties that Marianne faced in one way or another, she felt happy. Anna was the only person in her life who did not want to harm her or do her any harm. However, the fact that she was raising her daughter alone meant that Marianne had to take her to work at the bar, making it impossible for her to care for her child except during rare breaks from work. Over the years, Anna grew older, and those close to the Bachmeier family noticed that she treated her daughter like an adult despite her young age. She demanded both independence and responsibility from her daughter. Anna, in turn, was an unusually open and creative child. She was often left to herself, especially on days when her mother worked late into the night and then slept all day. Marianne was very aware that such a lifestyle was not suitable for raising a child. She sometimes even thought about finding a good foster family for her daughter, but she quickly tried to suppress that thought. At the same time, 7-year-old Anna enjoyed her freedom. She explored the surroundings of her neighborhood and wandered back and forth alone. She met various people, some of whom obviously had rather bad intentions. Anna also played with pets, which sometimes got her into trouble. This happened on May 5, 1980. According to the information available, Marianne had an argument with her daughter because she woke up in a bad mood and expressed a desire to skip school. The girl said she wanted to go to the park to play with her friends. Eventually, the mother gave in and allowed Anna to go play without guessing her true intentions. When Marianne returned home from work in the evening, she found that her daughter was still not home. She waited a few more hours, hoping the child would show up soon, but that did not happen. So the girl decided to go out on the street and try to find the child on her own. She asked some of her daughter's friends and their parents to find out anything about Anna's possible whereabouts, but no one knew anything. She seemed to have simply vanished into thin air. Realizing that she could not manage alone, Bachmeier turned to the police and reported the incident. The next day, another distressed person arrived at the police station, apparently wanting to report her future fiancé. She stated that her partner had apparently committed the murder of a girl who sometimes came to the apartment to play with the cats. At least he confessed to her himself. She added, among other things, that the girl's name was Anna. After hearing the woman's statement, the police realized that everything indicated that a 35-year-old man named Klaus had committed the crime. Afterward, he felt guilty. That is, his conscience would not leave him alone. As a result, he told his fiancée in detail what had happened. This triggered a fierce argument between the two, after which Klaus went to a bar and drank until he was unconscious. Klaus Grabowski had already had a run-in with the state at this point. He had previously been convicted of violating the sexual integrity of two girls. While in custody, he underwent a psychological evaluation, which found that he was addicted to attraction to minors. Moreover, he was practically incapable of self-control. As a result, the perpetrator was not sent to prison, but to a psychological help center. After several years, the authorities offered him a highly questionable chemical castration in exchange for early release. Klaus, in turn, agreed to the proposal without much thought. It should be noted that this procedure was practically painless. In fact, a person who has committed certain illegal acts is given a series of injections containing a drug that reduces the activity of hormones responsible for arousal and attraction. The idea is that a criminal who has undergone such correction will never again commit their misdeeds. However, modern experts believe that such a measure cannot completely free a person from obsessive thoughts and fantasies. In this case, it was even completely ineffective. This was primarily because the procedure described above was easily reversible. Nevertheless, Klaus was released and was soon no longer under police control. A few years later, Grabowski underwent hormone therapy to reverse the effects of chemical castration and increase his testosterone levels. Law enforcement generally did not advise against it, mainly because the man explained to them that he wanted to start a family. Thus, he gave the impression of a man who was leading a normal, happy life. To maintain this image and earn a living, he opened a small butcher shop. Over time, the people around him almost forgot about his reputation. The day after Anna's murder, the police went to Klaus's house, but he was no longer there. He took the girl's body with him and left a note for his fiancée, asking her to meet him at a bar that same evening to discuss what had happened. The authorities took advantage of the opportunity and arrested the man as soon as he appeared at the venue. Immediately after his arrest, Grabowski stated that he initially had no intention of touching Anna. He defended himself in the most disgusting way, claiming that the 7-year-old girl had seduced him and extorted money from him. He claimed the girl manipulated him by saying she would tell her mother about his attempts to touch her. Klaus then mentioned that he had hidden the victim's body in a cardboard box, which he placed on the shore of a nearby canal. Marianne was shocked and devastated when the authorities came to her house to inform her of her daughter's tragic death, but the worst phase of her life was yet to come. During the lengthy trial, the woman had to listen to the statements of various witnesses, all of whom said she was an incompetent mother and that her daughter had practically grown up on the street. According to those questioned, such an incident could have happened at any time, since the girl's mother was practically never home and worked in a bar until late at night. These words hurt Marianne, who was already inconsolable and angry. However, what bothered her the most was not that, but the fact that the defendant was likely to evade responsibility for his actions and escape deserved punishment. It was almost clear to everyone that Klaus had certain psychological problems that would spare him from prison. Therefore, Marianne began to plan revenge against the man who had taken her daughter's life and was aware that she would have to get her hands dirty in doing so. Klaus, for his part, continued to stick to his position, emphasizing that it was Anna who had seduced him and then manipulated and threatened him for money. In his opinion, the girl's behavior was the deciding factor that led him to commit the crime. He claimed he did it to avoid going to prison. After hearing Grabowski's false statement, Marianne came to what she thought was the only solution at the time. She bought a gun. After purchasing the weapon, she practiced shooting for several months. She did this secretly from her relatives so that no one would suspect anything. She realized that she could no longer listen to the perpetrator's false claims, and her patience simply ran out. It happened on March 6, 1981. That day, at around 10 a.m., Marianne entered the courtroom in Lübeck, arriving a few minutes late. Her face showed little to no emotion, her posture was upright, and her hands were in the pockets of her light coat. She stopped a few meters behind Klaus, standing still like a statue. At that moment, the trial was in full swing. Everything was going according to plan, and somehow, incredibly, Marianne had a gun from the world-renowned Italian company Beretta with her. It is still unclear how exactly she managed to pass all the strict security barriers of the courthouse, even by today's standards. Marianne felt as if time had stood still. This feeling lasted only a few seconds. Afterward, she sensed an opportunity to act. At that moment, her daughter's murderer was making another statement. The man stood facing the judge, not even realizing what was happening behind his back. At that point, Marianne had already pulled a pistol from her right pocket, and in the blink of an eye, she fired a series of precise shots, pulling the trigger 8 times. Only 7 of the 8 bullets hit Grabowski, who almost immediately fell to the ground. The 8th bullet never left the gun's muzzle, it jammed. Some in the public saw this as a form of divine justice, since only 7 bullets hit Klaus, the same age Anna was at the time of the crime. The expression on Marianne's face, the woman who had enacted this act of justice, did not change, showing once more her determination. She made no attempt to flee and did not resist when the guards arrested her. Shortly after, a court employee approached Klaus and confirmed that there was nothing more that could be done for him. At that point, a visible expression of relief appeared on Marianne's face, in stark contrast to her previous emotions. Of course, this was far from the end of the story. The girl still faced a trial she could not avoid. Those who saw Marianne during this time, or had contact with her, agreed that she was in a kind of trance, trying to understand what had happened to her and her daughter. Given this state of mind, the court psychiatrist conducted a preliminary examination to try to diagnose or guess what was going on in her head. To do this, he gave her a piece of paper and a pen and asked her to write something. The specialist tried to analyze the handwriting, not telling the subject what the purpose of the experiment was. Marianne took a pencil and wrote, "I did it for you, Anna." And next to this sentence, she drew 7 hearts, one for each year she had lived, or for each bullet that hit Klaus. The next day, all German newspapers published a photo of Marianne Bachmeier and labeled her the Revenge Mother. All in all, this was not surprising, as it was one of the most famous cases of vigilante justice in Europe, extensively reported by both European and international media. Among other things, various television teams from all over Europe traveled to Lübeck for an extended period. Shortly after the incident, Marianne was put on trial for the murder of Klaus Grabowski. During the trial, the woman stated that she was not fully aware of the actual situation and her actions. According to her own belief, she was in a kind of dream state. She even said she had seen her daughter, who she believed had walked past her in the courtroom. Bachmeier also made openly contradictory statements, which made her look even worse in front of the judge. For example, she claimed that she had originally bought the gun only to harm herself. However, no one in the courtroom believed this. It was generally assumed that the woman had practiced shooting with the weapon for a long time before using it on that day. Still, many people worldwide supported the defendant because she took justice into her own hands and gave the criminal no chance to go free again. At the same time, there were those who saw Marianne as a criminal who had no right to justice. They branded her a murderer and called her a bad and irresponsible mother who had given up 2 children for adoption. In March 1983, after lengthy jury deliberations, Marianne Bachmeier was convicted of manslaughter and illegal possession of an unregistered firearm. The combined sentence for these 2 charges was 6 years in prison. While the woman was in prison, many citizens sent her flowers, sweets, and letters of support and sympathy. However, there were also people who believed that the state should not tolerate vigilante justice. Furthermore, the public criticized West German justice for allowing a man who had committed offenses against minors to undergo libido reduction therapy after his release. After 3 years, the authorities decided that Bachmeier did not deserve such a severe sentence. Shortly after her release, Marianne Bachmeier sold the exclusive rights to her life story and published it in a news magazine for 100,000 Deutsche Marks. She stated that she did this only to pay off all the debts that had arisen from the trial. A few years later, she married a teacher and moved to Accra, the capital of Ghana, where she lived until 1990. Later, she divorced her husband and moved to Italy, specifically to the island of Sicily, where she worked in a hospice. Marianne remained in Italy until she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which forced her to return to Germany. Years later, when she realized that the disease was consuming her, she asked a friend to accompany her with a film camera until the last minutes of her life. She died on September 17, 1996, at the age of 46, in a hospital in Lübeck from cancer. Her final resting place is in a cemetery next to her daughter's grave, and since then, they could finally be together. Thank you for watching, and take care.
Nowadays, we mostly discuss well-known serial killers and criminals whose stories are told by the dozens, but few know anything about the lesser, known yet no less horrific serial killers of Russia. How many stories do you know about school children who became brutal serial killers at a young age? Surely many are familiar with names like Arkady Nieland, who was executed for 2 murders in the USSR at the age of 15, or Vladimir Vinikovsky, who had committed 8 brutal murders by the time he was just 16. And now it is time to talk about another brutal serial killer who made a name for himself in criminal history at the age of 16 when he first abused and killed a grandmother. Be sure to watch the video until the end, because I promise you the ending will surprise you greatly. Recently, YouTube has stopped recommending this channel, so I would like each of you to like the video now and leave a comment so we can crack YouTube's algorithms. If you don't like the video or want to stop watching, you can unlike it at any time. I would like to remind you that you are not judging the horrific story but my work on the video. Now let's get started. The funeral of a young man involves tears, alcohol, and then something completely wild, something a human being is seemingly incapable of. Right at the wake, one of the guests first seduces the widow. Later, he rapes the deceased's elderly mother in front of her and brutally kills her. To cover his tracks, the perpetrator sets fire to the house where the drunken guests are sleeping. This is not a script for a film yet to be shot, but the end of a murderer's bloody path that began behind the walls of a one-room apartment in Tula. If the killer is not stopped, each of his subsequent atrocities will be even more horrific. Once initiated, the process of losing one's human form is irreversible without medical or legal intervention. This was also true in the case of a serial killer who only attracted elderly women. An old worn boot lying next to a monument, a headscarf hanging from a fence, a holy umbrella among graves. All of this is material evidence of a series of gruesome crimes committed in Tula in the 1990s. No other criminal case contains as many photographs of cemeteries as this one. The killer found most of his victims, elderly women, in the cemetery among the graves. In the deathly silence, he forced them to perform sexual acts and then took their lives. But let's start from the very beginning. The year was 1989 in Tula. One day a worker at a flour factory arrived for her evening shift. She was usually greeted by her replacement, but the building was silent. When she went into the next room, she was met with a horrific sight as a blood-soaked corpse lay on the floor. Investigators quickly arrived at the crime scene and identified the victim as Valentina Mukhina, a waiter at the flour factory. The woman was only a few weeks away from retirement. The first question was why the innocent Valentina was killed, and then the experts called and made a shocking statement that the elderly woman had been abused before her death. Investigators managed to reconstruct the sequence of events, which suggested Valentina Mukhina was at her workplace, probably sitting at her desk waiting for the next grain delivery, when she was attacked by an unknown assailant. But attacking someone, especially in broad daylight and almost in front of other employees, is very risky. Initial suspicion fell on someone from her own circle. The question remained regarding who hated the elderly Valentina Mukhina. The news of the brutal incident paralyzed work in the factory. All employees were horrified, the superiors were perplexed, and everyone asked themselves the same question. This was the beginning of a terrible story that lasted several years and kept all the inhabitants of the city in fear. Investigators put forward one theory after another, wondering if the abuse was the main reason for the attack, or if the monster wanted to rob its victim but lost control in the face of her helplessness and fear. However, a mill is hardly a place criminals would specifically go to. On the evening of the day the body was found, the murder weapon, which was a stone, was also found. All the workers were checked to see who was where at the time of the crime. After several dozen people had been questioned, a man told an interesting story that had happened a year earlier. That day, Valentina Mukhina noticed that one of the drivers was behaving very strangely as he had difficulty getting out of the cab, as if something was hindering him. The woman looked into the cab, where there was a bag on the passenger seat, but she couldn't look inside because the driver was coming back. Valentina raised the alarm because the strange man had worried her greatly. As he was about to leave, he was stopped by factory workers who demanded he show the bag. The driver grabbed a car jack and appeared to resist a search, but eventually someone put their hand inside the bag and the young man pulled out a chicken. One might think why anyone would do such a thing, but a few days later the same driver tried to smuggle a sack of flour out of the factory and was caught. Valentina demanded that the police be called, to which the perpetrator shouted that she should be careful that a brick doesn't fall on her head. The investigation continued and a suspect emerged. It turned out that the man had been sentenced to a year in prison for attempting to steal a sack of flour and had just been released from prison the day before the brutal act. The suspect, Shacharbina, was found and brought to the police station for questioning. Investigators determined that the seemingly obvious perpetrator had been released from prison only 2 days after the attack on Mukina, making it impossible for him to have committed the attack. The investigation lasted almost a year with no new leads, evidence, or witnesses. The investigators reached a dead end and were ready to close the case due to a lack of evidence and suspects. But after 11 months, the case took an unexpected turn when a lifeless body was found in a river. On a November day at the age of 45, Albina Boldareva was walking home from work. The woman always took the same route, crossing a bridge she knew well. But that evening everything changed. Quick steps approached Boldareva, who couldn't even turn around before a knife was stabbed in her back. The killer had planned everything meticulously, knowing the people from the nearby factory had already passed by, and that in the next few hours, no one would stop him from completing his plan. But he had miscalculated on one point, and thanks to this the investigation finally made progress. That evening, 2 female workers stayed at the factory after their shift to paint a wall newspaper for an important event and left later than everyone else. When they reached the bridge, they encountered a horrific sight where a man was trying to undress a half-dead woman and, hearing noises, fled hastily. Albina Boldareva was found still alive. The 2 factory workers helped the woman up, carried her to the street, and flagged down a car. At the hospital, she lost consciousness, and doctors determined that the maniac had abused his victim. The perpetrator's modus operandi was very similar to the case that had occurred a year earlier. The injured Boldareva was unconscious most of the night, but regained consciousness during the day. Police officers guarded the door, and the doctors allowed investigators to speak with her. The woman told law enforcement that the perpetrator was very young, wore a knitted cap pulled over his eyes, and had rubber shoes with rolled-up cuffs on his feet. There were few details that could be used to identify a suspect, and no further clues were found at the crime scene, not even footprints. The only way to identify the tormentor was by his face. The investigators checked all those previously convicted of similar crimes and searched all the files on suspected men who were receiving psychiatric treatment. Hundreds of people came under suspicion, including many young men with abnormalities, but after one day the investigators' last hopes collapsed when a call came from the hospital stating that the patient had died. No one could identify the perpetrator, and the investigation stalled again. Time passed, and more than 4 months had passed since the last attack. Over time, the terrible incident on the bridge over the Voronka River was forgotten, but a new crime revived the memory of the 2 gruesome murders. On March 18, 1991, 51-year-old Natalia Pryaniknikova was walking from the train station toward her home through the woods. Everything was quiet until a young man approached her. He looked suspicious as he walked slowly and looked Natalia straight in the eyes. The woman thought he was going to snatch her purse and held on to it, but the unknown man pulled out a knife. Everything went completely differently than the criminal had planned, because the woman was nimble and hit him with her purse first, causing the knife to fall from his hand. The murderer was so surprised by this defense that he was paralyzed. Natalia had no idea at the time that she would be able to fend off a criminal whom by then the entire town was already afraid of. The robbery in the woods ended in a fiasco for the criminal, and moreover he made a huge mistake by running away and leaving behind the knife he had used to kill his previous victim. This gave the investigators a crucial piece of evidence. Experts determined that the knife was homemade. Natalia reported that the perpetrator had a very strange gait. The search radius was shrinking, but there were still no suspects, and the killer himself had no intention of stopping. The brutal murderer usually took long breaks before committing his next crime, but this time, apparently frustrated by his failure, he attacked a new victim after just 5 days. This time the victim was unable to escape the killer. The body was found near the crime scene where the perpetrator had attacked his victim from behind, abused her, and killed her. The investigators were baffled as 2 years of searching had passed, and the killer was still at large. They decided to focus on the murder weapon they had found. The knife was unusually made, consisting of a metal pin wrapped in insulating tape, with the blade itself welded to the fitting. In those years, welding machines were only available in factories, which further narrowed the pool of suspects. A few days later, the investigator managed to find another woman who almost became the next victim. However, she did not go to the police immediately because the perpetrator was unable to attack her due to the timely arrival of passers-by. The investigator tried to elicit more details from the witness, but she could not remember anything. However, she did know a very strange story that could finally help solve the case that had remained unsolved for over 2 years. And now we are nearing the end, so if you have watched this far, perhaps you like my work and deserve a subscription to the channel. The woman told the investigator that there was a student at School 13 who had held a teacher in the restroom. This story needed to be confirmed, and the investigator was able to determine that this incident had indeed occurred, only it had been kept secret from the police. The high school student had attacked the deputy headmistress in the school restroom late at night and began to tear off her clothes. Suddenly, she realized the attacker was one of their students. The boy panicked and ran away. The scandal was covered up, although the entire school learned of the incident. The unusual case piqued the interest of law enforcement officials, especially since they had already tracked down the killer. Parallel to the strange story from School Number 13, investigators came to the locomotive plant to inquire if anyone had recently made a knife there. It turned out that a few months earlier a young man had asked to weld a blade onto a fitting to make a knife. The boy's description matched that of the attacker and was identified as Sergei Sukhanov. The investigator who came to his apartment asked one of the residents if he knew 17-year-old Sergei Sukhanov. The resident pointed to a teenager standing next to him and said that was him. No one could believe that the small, thin teenager who had just graduated from school was a brutal maniac. It was decided to search his apartment. Initially, small clues were found, such as a knitted hat and rubber boots, which the second victim had described, but the evidence was indirect and wasn't enough to prosecute. The only surviving victim, who had defended herself against her attackers, didn't dare go for identification because she feared he might have friends. Law enforcement officers eventually managed to persuade the victim to come along. However, at the moment of identification, the woman didn't point at anyone. But the strangest thing was yet to come, because the killer recognized his victim himself. It seemed as if everything was over, and the criminal had been caught. He would be convicted, and the video could be turned off. But believe me, the worst part of this story is yet to come. Sergei thought the victim had survived and had nothing to fear, so he confessed. Beyond that, Sukhanov was identified by Depot employees who had provided him with a knife, and later by flour factory workers. Sergei Nikolaevich Sukhanov was born on June 22, 1973 in Tula and was the only child of a troubled family. His father had legal troubles and a criminal record. Sukhanov Jr. lived with his parents and paternal grandmother in a one-room apartment. The retired woman was strict and constantly criticized him, provoking conflicts, so Sergei grew up in a socially difficult environment. As a result, as a teenager, Sukhanov began to exhibit deviant behavior and signs of misogyny toward older women who were powerfully built and resembled his grandmother. Sukhanov attended School Number 13. In 1988, Sergei attacked the teacher in the school restroom and attempted to sexually assault her. However, the teacher recognized Sukhanov and he was forced to flee. The incident was kept secret from the police. However, Sukhanov was registered in a psychiatric hospital and subjected to a forensic psychiatric examination, which declared him sane. During one of the examinations, he stated that his motive for the attack was revenge for poor grades, but during the fight, she aroused him, and he decided to attack her. After the examination, the future killer returned to school, where he soon began enticing one of his classmates to engage in lewd acts and when she rejected him, Sergei showed signs of mental disorder. At that time, there was only one punishment for brutal assaults on women. But there was a catch, because all of this didn't apply to a juvenile. Since Sergei was only 17 at the time of his arrest, he could only be sentenced to 10 years in prison. It seemed like the story was over and the killer had been caught and convicted. But no. 7 years later, in 1998, the city was shaken again because someone had once again hunted elderly women, but this time in the city cemetery. Pensioners came to tend the graves of their relatives and were killed. The first victim was 69 years old, the second 79, and the third 82. The elderly women were not only killed, but also abused, and all the murders were committed with particular cruelty. All investigators immediately remembered the name Sergei Sukhanov, as it was his signature. A check revealed that the convict was still serving his sentence, and therefore could not possibly have committed all these murders. So they thought there really was a new serial killer in the city. Ambushes were set up in cemeteries where investigators posing as visitors and local workers constantly lingered in the vicinity searching for suspicious men. But all this was to no avail. Soon after, a fourth murder occurred involving a grandmother who was 86 years old. The whole city was in a panic, and local newspapers wrote about a new serial killer, making pensioners afraid to go out on the streets, let alone visit the cemetery. The situation in Tula was very tense. Investigators had to arrest dozens of men again, check them, and release them again as if history were repeating itself. A few weeks later, while investigators were conducting all sorts of checks, a call came in from a woman who had smelled burning and went to her neighbor's house. The door was unlocked, and upon entering, she encountered a sight she will never forget. The mirrors in the house were covered, and there was complete silence. What had happened in that house was inhumane, and unfortunately something like that cannot be fully described even on YouTube. Crosses and stars had been carved on the bodies, and their breasts had been removed. This terrified all the police officers so much that many were put on sick leave after seeing the crime scene. Gradually, investigators figured out who might have been involved in this gruesome crime and questioned all neighbors and acquaintances. An already familiar name emerged in the case: Sukhanov. How could this be? Investigators sent an inquiry, and according to the documents, he was in prison, where he still had to serve at least 3 years. Now the documents were no longer enough for the law enforcement authorities, so they went to the prison to make sure the cruel monster was behind bars. How great was their surprise when he wasn't there. One of the rank and file officers had been negligent and hadn't determined Sukhanov's exact whereabouts or in which penal colony he was located. As it turned out, he had been released early for good behavior, but now a new problem arose regarding where to look for a murderer who already knew how to hide from investigators. This turned out to be easy because on March 29, 1999, Sergei Sukhanov was arrested. After his arrest, a blood sample was taken, and after 18 days the criminal finally confessed. By then, the results of the DNA test had proven his involvement in all the crimes. The murderer remembered exactly where and how he had attacked his victims, as well as what he had said during interrogations and reconstructive procedures. He was also identified by cemetery staff as the murderer of one of the victims. During interrogations, he stated that his mental disorder was the motive for all the crimes. Sergei insisted that he suffered from a split personality and had problems with self-control. The killer blamed his grandmother, who had scolded him as a child, and his cramped room in which he could not find peace. In the middle of the same year, Sergei Sukhanov's lawyer requested a forensic psychiatric examination at a court hearing to determine his sanity, which was approved. At the end of the same year, Sukhanov was examined at the Serbsky Institute of Psychiatry, where he was treated by specialists for the following 2 months. Based on a series of psychiatric reports, it was determined that Sergei Sukhanov suffered from a particularly dangerous form of schizophrenia, which made him unable to recognize his actions as socially dangerous at the time of the crime. On this basis, on January 20, 2000, the regional court declared Sergei Tsyukhanov insane, exonerated him from criminal responsibility, and sent him for compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital with intensive monitoring in the city of Oryol. There was much talk that the killer should have been shot the first time, but at that time such a punishment could not be imposed on juveniles. There has been only one case in history involving 15-year-old Arkady Nieland, and you can find a video about it on my channel. Sergei Tsyukhanov is alive and undergoing compulsory treatment, which he will continue until the end of his life. He is now over 50 years old. Thanks for watching and take care. Alexandria Madison Kostyl, known to everyone simply as Allie, was born on November 11, 1997, in St. Louis, Missouri. She was the eldest child in the family and had a younger brother named Andrew. Her parents, Keith and Cindy, remember her as being full of energy and zest for life since childhood. Her character was characterized by cheerfulness, activity, and optimism. In 2016, she graduated from Lindbergh High School and subsequently enrolled at the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, where she majored in marketing and dreamed of a career in the fashion industry. From her first day at university, she was eager to get involved in student life. Thanks to her sociability and natural charisma, she easily made friends and was the life of any group. She was also an avid athlete. In high school, she was a member of her school's track and field team and later joined the university golf club. She worked as a yoga and pilates instructor and trained for half marathons in her free time. She traveled extensively and tried to combine her travels with community service. During her trips to Africa and Peru, she taught English, making her travels a truly meaningful experience. Despite her busy schedule, Allie managed to juggle everything, was physically fit, made friends with her classmates, and excelled in her grades. Starting college was her first true experience of freedom and independence, which she quickly embraced and felt comfortable in. But despite everything, she felt like something was missing. She hoped to find someone special at university with whom she could build a relationship. During her freshman year, it seemed as if she had found that person. She met Brandon Thiesfeld, a fellow student her age. He was charming, educated, and always looked impeccable. Brandon came from a wealthy family in the suburbs of Fort Worth, Texas. His father, Daniel Robert Thiesfeld, owned a successful private medical practice. Despite their mutual affection, they never became a real couple. The relationship was unstable. They broke up and reconnected, creating a complicated but not uncommon dynamic among college students. They spent a lot of time together, had an intimate relationship, but weren't officially together. Instead of traditional dates, they showed up at events together, including formal school dances. There were times when they had no contact for months, but each time ended with a renewed rapprochement. Close friends noticed that she was torn between hope and despair. It was obvious that she wanted a serious relationship, but Brandon wasn't ready for a commitment. Although to outsiders it appeared to be a clearly unequal relationship, at 21, she was under the influence of her feelings and didn't notice the obvious. Brandon had other girlfriends with whom he had similarly ambiguous relationships. He didn't discuss his intentions with them, thus creating the illusion of something greater. In the opinion of those around her, Brandon was arrogant. His position and his family's money made him feel untouchable. He was convinced that, thanks to his father's connections and resources, he could maneuver his way out of any situation. His behavior revealed narcissistic traits, which are unfortunately not uncommon. Over time, it became clear that behind his charming facade lay much more than one could have imagined. In the summer of 2019, Brandon and Allie were preparing for their final year of school. Instead of returning home, she decided to stay in the city, take summer courses, and enjoy her freedom by meeting up with friends. In July, her parents visited her and spent a few days with her in Oxford. The visit was peaceful. Afterward, they spoke regularly on the phone. On July 19, 2019, at around 7 p.m., She ended her phone call with her mother and prepared to meet friends at a bar. Shortly before midnight, at exactly 11:05 p.m., surveillance cameras captured her leaving the bar alone. She was clearly unsteady, possibly due to the alcohol or because she was completely focused on her phone. She got into a car she had booked through an app and drove home. But that night ended tragically. On the morning of July 20, during a routine patrol near Sardis Lake, about a 45-minute drive from Oxford, a deputy sheriff made a horrific discovery. At 10:23 a.m., the body of a young woman was found next to an abandoned fishing shack. Based on the nature of the injuries, it was clear that multiple shots had been fired and that the crime had occurred several hours earlier, when there was no longer any chance of survival. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been shot at least 9 times. Investigators found 11 shell casings at the scene. Personal belongings were scattered near the body, including a purse containing a student ID card. The woman's identity was quickly established. She was 21-year-old Alexandria Madison Kostyul, whom everyone called Allie. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the area. It was especially disturbing for students. Many began to fear that the perpetrator was still at large and that they, too, might be in danger. Her family, Cindy, Keith, and Andrew, initially couldn't believe what had happened. They had spoken with her on the phone just a few hours before the tragedy. During the conversation, she acted completely normally. She mentioned that she had taken an important exam that week and had slept a little during the day to gain strength for meeting her friends that evening. No one could have guessed that this would be her last conversation. According to the ballistics examination, Allie was sitting on a bench facing the attacker at the time of the attack. The shots were fired from different directions, as if the perpetrator had been walking around her. Everything pointed to premeditation and cruelty. The impression was that he wanted to make absolutely sure she wouldn't survive. Why and who could do such a thing to someone who seemingly had no enemies remained a mystery. Allie was friendly and open, and no one could remember her ever having an argument with anyone. Searching for answers, investigators went to her apartment. Their main goal was to find her cell phone, as it was known that she had texted someone shortly before her disappearance. It was suspected that this particular person might have something to do with the case. The phone was nowhere to be found, neither in her purse nor in the apartment, given that she had used it literally minutes before the tragedy. Investigators concluded that it had been taken by the perpetrator. This confirmed their suspicions that the device might contain crucial information. During the search, an Apple Watch synchronized with the phone was found. This provided access to the call log and messages. This was the turning point in the case. It became clear that Allie had been texting Brandon before her death. The messages revealed that they had arranged to meet immediately after leaving the bar. This information immediately changed the course of the investigation. There was now a motive, and the investigation focused on Brandon Thiesfeld. The police already had sufficient grounds to summon him for questioning. He was notified and agreed to come, but the next day he failed to show up. When they called again, he stated that he could not come because he was drunk. The appointment was then rescheduled for 8:30 a.m. the next morning, but he failed to show up again. At this point, it was clear that he was trying to hide. Based on his cell phone and bank card data, it was determined that he had left the state and was heading toward Memphis, Tennessee. His car's license plate played a key role, a personalized license plate bearing the inscription "Take 31. Thanks to this detail, his whereabouts were quickly determined. Brandon was arrested at a gas station. A gun was found in his car that exactly matched the one used in the attack. The most compelling evidence, however, was the blood stain on his shirt. An examination confirmed it was Allie's blood. On July 22, Brandon was officially charged with first-degree murder. His arrest was a pivotal moment in the investigation. Finally, there was irrefutable evidence of his involvement in the tragedy. 2 days after the body was discovered, a memorial service was held. Hundreds of people, university students, and Oxford residents gathered. This was a clear expression of public grief and solidarity. The funeral took place on July 27, another difficult moment for all who knew and loved her. Allie's death shocked the local community. It was hard to believe that someone they knew had committed such a cruel act. Several months before the tragedy, Allie and Brandon had exchanged letters in which possible motives could be discerned. On April 12, 2019, Allie announced that she suspected she was pregnant. She sent a photo of the test which showed a barely visible second line, possibly a positive result. This news marked the beginning of a chain of events that culminated in tragedy. Although the test did not provide a conclusive result, the fact of a possible pregnancy triggered an extremely aggressive reaction in Brandon. Allie suggested discussing it in person, but he declined. Instead, he sharply expressed his anger and stated that this situation was destroying his life. He urged Allie to abort the child and made it clear that he would not assume any obligations either during or after the pregnancy. Correspondence seized during the investigation reveals that Allie continued to approach him, hoping for attention and support, but received only coldness and hostility. 1 week before the crime on July 12, 2019, Brandon left Oxford and drove to his parents' house in Fort Worth, Texas. There he retrieved the gun he later used. He even posted a photo of it on Snapchat, demonstrating his complete indifference to the consequences. Disturbing evidence was found on his laptop. His search history included queries such as, "How can you reliably tie someone up?" and "How can you avoid punishment for a crime?" These details indicated careful preparation. Upon further investigation, investigators discovered even more frightening details. Brandon visited online auctions in search of silencers, bullets, and masks. He also studied the biographies of famous criminals and was particularly interested in the methods Ted Bundy used to trap his victims. All of this pointed to a pre-planned plan to lure Allie to a remote location. On July 17, after a period of silence, he contacted her again and stated he was willing to discuss a possible pregnancy. On July 19, he suggested a face-to-face meeting, assuring her that he wanted to speak privately without strangers present. In reality, however, he was trying to avoid witnesses. Surveillance cameras recorded Brandon's pickup truck approaching Allie's house around 12 p.m. About half an hour later, he was there. Later, his car was already driving toward Sardis Lake. Cell phone locations confirmed that Allie and Brandon's devices were moving in the same direction. The exact circumstances of the encounter remained unknown, but the attack occurred between 1:30 and 20:30 a.m. A local resident walking his dog later reported hearing several gunshots shortly before 3:00 a.m. After the incident, Brandon returned to Oxford and took Allie's cell phone with him. Later that night, he turned it off. Soon after, he began searching the internet for information on how to intercept police radios to get ahead of law enforcement. The next morning, he watched the local news, and when it was announced that the body had been found, his behavior became even more disturbing. Brandon acted as if nothing had happened. Just hours after the crime, he showed up at a party with friends and flaunted the weapon he had used to commit the crime. Photos of them together, taken in December 2016, soon surfaced on social media. At that time, they had both just begun their studies at the University of Mississippi. One of the photos shows a party at a fraternity whose pillars were later decorated with black mourning ribbons. In an official statement, the fraternity expressed the hope that Allie's loved ones would find peace in remembering the impact she had on the lives of their family and friends. Her friend later recounted on social media that Brandon had caused Allie pain and abused her trust for several years while she lay in his arms, tearfully trying to forget his cruelty. He was soon formally charged with a crime. It turned out that Brandon had already been targeted by law enforcement. He had been arrested twice in Mississippi for appearing in public while intoxicated and for possession of alcohol while underage. His father, a pain management specialist, declined to comment in detail, stating simply, "His son is innocent and is appealing to the public." An old post was found on his social media, a photo of Brandon at the age of 17, training with a gun. His father described him at the time as a tactical expert. The public reaction to the tragedy was massive. Social media expressed grief, photos were posted, and memories were shared. Her cousin wrote a post explaining why women are afraid to say no, because they don't know whether it will end in an argument or with bullets and a dead body by the water's edge. Friends organized a memorial service in her honor at Lindber High School. It was revealed that Brandon had hired the well-known attorney Steve Faries, a defense attorney in federal cases. The descriptions of his behavior in the investigative reports sounded like the characterization of a person with deviance, cold-bloodedness, lack of reason, and indifference to consequences. The evidence was irrefutable. The cartridge cases found at the crime scene matched his weapon. Correspondence with Ali provided an accurate chronology, and a blood test on his clothing confirmed that the blood came from the victim. A letter was found during a search of Brandon's room. Although it didn't contain a direct confession, its contents suggested an internal conflict. He wrote about his addiction, his dark thoughts after consuming alcohol and illicit substances. One sentence in particular puzzled investigators. He suspected that everything would end either in death or in prison. The prosecution interpreted this as evidence of a well-thought-out plan with the possible intention of first killing Ali and then taking his own life. However, this didn't happen. He attempted to escape. It was later revealed that she was not pregnant at the time of her death. This led those around her to suspect that she might have been pregnant after all, and that the pregnancy had been terminated due to stress or other reasons. This version was supported by a message in which Ali sent Brandon a photo of her stomach and remarked that it was no longer as flat, which suggested that it would soon be more difficult to hide. Her refusal to terminate the pregnancy could have been a trigger that exacerbated the tension between them. Brandon, however, did not believe her words, according to the investigation. It cannot be ruled out that this very photo was the final straw. At the first court hearing, the defense tried to secure bail, but given his attempted escape, the chances were slim. Then the tactics changed. The defense requested a psychiatric report to prove he was not mentally competent at the time of the crime. The results showed that he was fully competent. A further hearing took place on August 30, in which the prosecution sought the maximum sentence. The prosecution charged Brandon with particularly serious crimes with aggravating circumstances, which carry the maximum sentence. To achieve this, the prosecution had to prove 2 crimes: kidnapping and intentional homicide. Despite the abundant evidence, Brandon continued to maintain his innocence. The trial was postponed for almost 2 years due to the pandemic. In August 2021, Brandon changed his mind and pleaded guilty. This was part of an agreement with the prosecution that allowed him to avoid the death penalty, which he faced throughout the investigation. Instead, he was found guilty of first-degree felony murder. This outcome suited the prosecution, as it would have been difficult to prove kidnapping as a separate offense. For those close to him, the news that Brandon was involved in the case was a real shock. One of his former classmates, who had lived with him in the same dorm for a year, reported that Brandon constantly talked about his father and his money and was convinced that he could get out of any situation thanks to his father's connections. At his trial, Brandon tried to show remorse, but many viewed this as an insincere attempt to secure a lighter sentence. Some believed that his remorse had nothing to do with taking Ali's life, but rather with ruining his own. He addressed Ali's family, apologizing for the pain he had caused them and asking for forgiveness. He acknowledged that he had irrevocably altered his family's life, as well as his own. He claimed he had asked God for forgiveness and hoped that one day he would receive forgiveness from people as well. Both families, the Koschels and the Thiesfelds, were present at the hearing. Ali's mother delivered a statement in which she unemotionally expressed her frustration. She called Brandon cruel, unfeeling, manipulative, and dangerous. She expressed deep regret for failing to protect her daughter and firmly stated that he deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. Her words were filled with pain and anger, but also with hope that he would think about his crime every day. The court sentenced Brandon to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his sentence in a Mississippi correctional facility known as Parchman Prison. Despite his confession, he continued to claim that the crime was not premeditated and explained his actions as being under the influence of alcohol and illegal substances. However, the files, including his internet searches, clearly refuted this version. Allie Koschel's death is an irreparable loss that is difficult to comprehend. However, her story serves as a reminder of the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships. During the investigation, truly horrific details about Brandon's behavior came to light, and his conviction, while harsh, was an important step toward justice. Although Allie's life ended at her age, her memory lives on. This woman's story has inspired many to speak out, defend those who suffer in silence, and take action. The world is full of dangers. Sometimes evil isn't revealed until too late. That's why it's so important to be observant, listen to your intuition, and offer help when someone might be in danger. History is a call to action and protect those we love. Thanks for watching and take care.
The images you see on your screen were recorded by surveillance cameras installed in the city of Lynn, in the Mexican state of Guanajuato. They show the final movements of a 12-year-old boy named Mateo, who disappeared without a trace shortly after leaving school. The desperate search for the child shocked the entire country and received an unprecedented response on social media, where diverse versions of what might have happened to him began to spread. According to available information, Mateo Santiago Ramirez was born on October 18, 2012. He was the second child of his parents, Father Gerardo Ramirez and Mother Maria Teresa Martinez, also known as Maritter. Unfortunately, not many details are available about the boy's early years. All that is known is that he grew up with his parents, his brother Angel, and his sister Camila. The Ramirez Martinez family was very happy, and they described Mateo as a friendly, open, and bright child. Around July or August, they moved to a quiet village in the Chapelita neighborhood, a suburb of Lynn. Shortly after the move, Mateo began his year of middle school. Since it was quite far from his home, he had to take the bus. Mateo's parents described him as an incredibly responsible child who never missed class. In other words, he had a strict daily routine, which he usually followed to the smallest detail. Although Mateo hadn't lived in the area long, by the beginning of 2025, almost all the locals knew him, and they all saw him as a friendly, responsible, and polite boy who never got into trouble. Mateo also had a good reputation at school, and as far as I know, he even developed a close relationship with one of his female classmates. Mateo often walked her home, which is why the other classmates considered them a couple. Overall, it was fair to say that he led a happy and carefree life, just like any other boy his age. But on Tuesday, February 4, 2025, everything changed fundamentally. According to Mateo's parents, the morning began as usual. They went to work, and he went to school. Mateo usually came home at 11:30 a.m. At that time, his mother, Maria Teresa, also returned from work to pick him up from school. However, as I mentioned before, everything went differently that day, and Mateo didn't come home at his usual time. In the first few minutes of his absence, Maria Teresa tried to calm herself down. She thought he was probably out with his girlfriend, doing his homework at school, or that his bus was simply late. But as so often happens, the minutes passed, and Maria Teresa began to worry about her son. When it was 3:00 p.m., and there was still no news from Mateo, she persistently started calling him on his cell phone, but her calls went unanswered. At the same time, the woman sent her son several messages via a messenger service, but these apps only work when there is an internet connection, and Maria Teresa, seeing that the messages simply weren't reaching her son, assumed he had run out of credit. Since she was seriously worried, the woman informed her husband that the boy hadn't come home. After this call, the mood in the house became even more anxious. When Gerardo returned from work, he decided to go out into the street and look for his son. First, the man asked neighbors and friends, concluding that Mateo had simply met an acquaintance and forgot to tell his parents that he would be a little later than usual. At that time, the boy's parents only had his last location, which they had determined with the help of a special tracking app. This led them to one of the city streets where Mateo didn't usually go. The app also showed that his cell phone was not hidden in a house or building but was lying directly on the street. However, when the boy's parents arrived at this location, they could find nothing. Finally, they decided to contact the authorities and post information about their son's disappearance on social media. This was apparently done so that all their acquaintances would learn about Mateo's disappearance at the same time and could potentially help them in the search. After some time, with the help of friends and relatives, they searched the area again, questioning residents to find out if anyone had seen Mateo. Around the same time, Maria Teresa began to relive the last few hours she had spent with her son. For some reason, she came to the conclusion that they might have argued, and that was why Mateo didn't want to return home. But no matter how hard the woman searched for a reason for their possible argument, she couldn't find one. It is known that on the same day, the authorities activated the Amber Alert system, which informed all other law enforcement officers about the disappearance of 12-year-old Mateo. In this report, he was described as a boy with straight black hair, brown eyes, and a large, round birthmark on his hip. It was also stated that he was about 130 meters tall and wore a school uniform, white sneakers, and a burgundy jacket. However, this information was later corrected, and it was reported that Mateo was taller than initially stated and that his jacket was pink, not red. As expected, the first night after Mateo's disappearance was full of sorrow and uncertainty for his parents. In the early morning of February 5, they, along with their neighbors, gathered in small groups to continue the search. It is important to note that they were later joined by a large number of people who knew neither the family nor Mateo. They all walked through the streets calling the boy's name, urging him to return home, and distributed leaflets with information about the boy to everyone they met, asking them to call the police if they learned anything. In addition, people posted flyers on poles, trees, and the facades of homes and businesses in the area. Mateo's classmates also joined the search, trying to draw as much attention to the case as possible. The administration of the school Mateo attended, as well as other children, not only supported the search, but also posted information about his disappearance inside the school. Indeed, by this time, Mateo's case had not only garnered significant attention on social media, where literally hundreds of people shared his photos, but had also attracted the attention of local and national media, which supported his family's appeal for the child's return alive and unharmed. However, at this point, there were still no clues or traces of the boy. Despite the lack of results, Mateo's relatives and the police continued to search the streets and review surveillance videos. It is important to note that, although the media revealed quite a few details about the boy's disappearance, the local authorities asked his relatives not to publish the most important information available at the time. I suspect they wanted a certain degree of secrecy so that the investigation would run as smoothly and effectively as possible. After a few days, it was revealed that the authorities had found Mateo in the surveillance camera footage. This wasn't really surprising, since many images had been analyzed, not only from the cameras near Mateo's school, but also from other cameras along the entire route he usually took home. Thanks to these images, it was determined that on the day of his disappearance, he had left school with his girlfriend, as usual. I already told you that Mateo always accompanied her home, and this information was also confirmed by a taco vendor who usually stood on the corner next to their house. The man said he remembered Mateo because he walked past his shop every day with his girlfriend. According to him, he saw the teenagers together that day, and they seemed perfectly normal. The cameras then filmed the moment Mateo got off the bus. It was the same means of transport the boy usually took home, but for some reason, Mateo didn't get off at his usual stop. According to authorities, he did so to visit Christian Augusto Giaffetta GT Mez, a 34-year-old man who worked as a doctor. According to some reports, Mateo got into a white van belonging to Christian, which was parked in front of a small two-story building, and shortly after, the trail was lost. You've probably been wondering who this Christian is and what his relationship to Mateo was. Well, it is known that he worked as a doctor and had a medical license. In 2009, Christian graduated from a local chemistry laboratory and in 2017 from the Medical University of Lens. He then began treating patients near Mateo's house, specializing in the treatment of people with diabetes. At the same time, it was known that Christian also advertised his services through a so-called Mexican Comprehensive Care Association. Practically at the beginning of the investigation, some media outlets reported that Mateo spent a lot of time with this man, helping him with various minor matters. However, the boy's parents denied this. They stated that their son had never been to his office and that he didn't have a particularly close relationship with Christian. According to them, the boy always had the same daily routine, so it seemed strange that he even had time to help a man he barely knew. The investigation continued, however, and Christian became the prime suspect in the case. The authorities then contacted the man and asked him then to come to the police station to show them the surveillance camera footage installed in his office and to answer a few questions. Although Christian had originally agreed to attend the meeting, he did not show up. For this reason, the authorities had to go to his office themselves, but were unable to locate him because Christian was no longer there. In fact, the only person they were able to speak with was the man's mother, whose identity was later withheld. The woman said she couldn't show them the camera footage because it had long since stopped working. Eventually, the authorities left the scene quietly, but continued their investigation into Christian, as he remained the prime suspect in Mateo's disappearance. While the investigation continued, Mateo's parents, relatives, and friends participated in a vigil of sorts. They lit candles and said prayers in the hope that the boy would soon be found alive and unharmed. Around the same time, surveillance camera footage surfaced online showing Mateo's last movements. Later, during their investigation, the authorities were able to determine that the boy, after getting into Christian's van, had been taken to another location in a neighboring district. After determining the address, the authorities went there to find out if the man was present and if he could clarify the situation to clear himself of any suspicion. Upon arrival, they found a small house and a gate locked with a padlock. Nevertheless, they did not leave, assuming that this was just a strategy by Christian to make it appear as if he was not at home. After a while, the authorities entered the house using tools to bypass the lock. There are two versions of what happened next. According to the first version, before the officers entered the house, Christian began screaming and saying that he was going to take his own life. According to the second version, the officers found a wounded man in the house. It is suspected that he first fired several shots toward the front door and then injured himself with his own pistol. By the time the first ambulance arrived at the scene, Christian already had multiple injuries. However, his life was not in danger. The man was conscious and was able to answer the authorities' questions. He confessed to the kidnapping, rape, and subsequent murder of Mateo. Christian also told the authorities the exact location where they could find the boy's body. The man was then taken to the hospital and placed under constant police surveillance to prevent possible attempts on his life by local residents. Based on Christian's information, the authorities began searching for Mateo's body. It was believed to be buried about 15 kilometers from the man's house. After a lengthy search, the authorities finally managed to locate the body of the 12-year-old boy. It was lying near a small concrete post, surrounded by bushes and covered with a thin layer of earth. As Christian later said, he simply hadn't managed to bury Mateo properly. After some time, the boy's body was taken to the coroner's office for an autopsy, and only then was it released to his parents. Judging by the bloodstains discovered at the site, Mateo may have died there. At that time, however, the authorities were still uncertain and therefore made no public statement. All that was known was that the police had cordoned off the area, awaiting the arrival of more qualified personnel from the Jalisco State Prosecutor's Office. Subsequently, numerous traces were found not only at that location, but also in Christian's office and his apartment. It was there that the key evidence was found that made it possible to establish that Mateo had originally been attacked at that very location. Shortly thereafter, the Guanajuato Attorney's Office issued an official statement announcing both the discovery of the boy's body and the further progress of the investigation. The statement also confirmed that Mateo's parents would receive all necessary psychological and financial support. This statement provoked mixed reactions from the public. This was particularly evident on social media, where literally hundreds of users condemned what happened to Mateo and demanded justice. However, the authorities also expressed their disapproval of the incident, promising that this crime would not go unpunished. Meanwhile, some civil society organizations, primarily dedicated to protecting children, expressed their solidarity with the Ramírez Martínez family and questioned the secrecy protocols followed by the authorities. In other words, they disliked the highly secretive nature of the investigation, which led people to speculate and develop their own theories about the nature and extent of the crime. Some of them, for example, said that the police officers who took Christian to the hospital had access to his cell phone and found a large number of photos of children. Although this has not been confirmed by the public prosecutor's office in any official statement, I decided to mention this, as it has been discussed repeatedly on social media. There was also much talk about at least one other person being involved in this case. However, the authorities stated that at this point, Christian was the only suspect. It should also be mentioned that there were some who wanted to exploit the situation for their own purposes and organized a fundraising campaign intended to help Mateo's parents and cover the costs of his funeral. The parents themselves, however, stated that they were not convinced of this, knew nothing about it, and advised all residents not to fall for these scams. Furthermore, it had been announced shortly before that the municipality would cover all major costs. It is known that Mateo's funeral took place with dozens of residents attending, including not only those who knew him personally, but also people who were simply affected by this tragedy. The next day, a special memorial service was held in the boy's memory, where he was honored with sincere words of love, white balloons, and flowers. On the same day, new information appeared in the media about the condition of Christian, who was still in the hospital. It was assumed that he would remain there until his condition stabilized. Meanwhile, local children's rights organizations issued another statement calling on the authorities to take decisive action against the man. On Wednesday, February 11, the public prosecutor's office announced that Christian's official arrest would take effect immediately after his discharge from the hospital. After some time, the man, guarded by numerous members of the National Guard and the city police, was taken to a social rehabilitation center. The very next day, the first court hearing in his case took place, in which he was officially charged with crimes against sexual integrity, kidnapping, and murder under aggravated circumstances. During the hearing, Christian's defense pointed out numerous violations by the authorities during his arrest and asked for additional time to gather as much evidence as possible to prove the man's innocence. Towards the end of the day, it was announced that the next hearing would be postponed until Monday, February 17. The legal representatives of Mateo's parents continued to insist that Christian must be held accountable for his actions. They also claimed that the boy never helped the man in his office, though for some reason they were unable to clarify exactly how their relationship came about. To date, the case has not progressed to a final verdict. The court has yet to decide what should happen to Christian. It is worth noting that new hypotheses about what really happened continue to emerge on social media, demonstrating that this horrific and painful case has had a profound impact on Mexican society as a whole. For now, all that remains is to hope that Mateo's parents receive justice and that the truths, which remain unknown, will finally come to light. Thanks for watching, and take care.